Have you ever heard of the Dybbuk Box? It's not just any old wine cabinet. This unassuming wooden box is said to be one of the most haunted objects in the world, carrying a dark history and a malevolent entity trapped within. Its story is a chilling journey that began in the aftermath of World War II and has terrified owners for decades. So, what is a Dybbuk? In Jewish folklore, a Dybbuk is a restless, often malicious spirit that possesses a living person. The story of this particular box starts with a Holocaust survivor from Poland named Havila, who managed to escape to Spain and purchased the wine cabinet. But this wasn't for storing wine. According to her granddaughter, Havila and her friends used it in a seance, attempting to contact spirits. During the ritual, they accidentally summoned something they couldn't control, a Dybbuk. Havila somehow managed to trap the spirit inside the box. She kept it with her for the rest of her life, always warning her family never, ever, to open it. She even wanted to be buried with it, but that request was denied. After she passed away at 103, her family, unaware of the box's true nature, decided to sell it at an estate sale. And that's where our modern story begins, with a man named Kevin Mannis. In 2001, Kevin Mannis, a writer and small antique business owner, attended an estate sale in Portland, Oregon. He was drawn to this simple wooden wine cabinet. The seller, the granddaughter of the original owner, explained its strange history. She told him her grandmother called it the Dybbuk Box and insisted it was never to be opened because it contained a malicious spirit. She even told him a story about how her mother suffered a stroke the very day she was given the box as a gift. Kevin, being a bit of a skeptic, was intrigued but not scared. He bought it and took it back to his workshop. He decided to give it to his mother as a birthday gift. He called her to offer it, but just 5 minutes later, his mother called him back, hysterical. She had suffered a stroke. It was a terrifying parallel to the story the granddaughter had told him. Shaken, Kevin decided to keep the box for himself. But the weirdness was just getting started. He started having recurring nightmares of an old hag-like creature. He would wake up with bruises and marks on his body. He reported seeing shadowy figures darting around his workshop and hearing disembodied whispers. One day, all the light bulbs in his shop inexplicably shattered. The final straw came when he found all his employees had quit, claiming the shop was haunted and they were too terrified to work there. They described seeing shadows, hearing strange noises, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Desperate, Kevin tried to give the box away, but it always found its way back to him, returned by friends or family who experienced their own terrifying encounters. Unable to get rid of it, and frankly terrified by it, Kevin Mannis decided to put the Dybbuk Box up for sale on eBay in 2003. His listing was on just a simple sales post. It was a desperate warning. He detailed all the horrifying events that had happened since he bought it. He wrote, "I would not have you open this box. There is a dark and restless spirit that I believe is attached to this box." The story captivated the internet. The auction went viral, and people from all over the world followed the saga of the cursed cabinet. The winning bidder was a college student named Iosif Nitsky. He, too, documented his experiences online. He reported a series of strange occurrences. Electronics in his dorm room would malfunction. His hair started falling out in clumps, and he was plagued by insomnia and a constant feeling of being watched. After a short but terrifying ownership, Iosif put the box back on eBay. This time, it was purchased by Jason Haxton, a museum director in Missouri. Jason was a skeptic but also a curious academic. He wanted to scientifically investigate the object and its alleged curse. He approached it with a methodical mindset, documenting everything. But even he couldn't escape the box's influence. Soon after acquiring it, Jason developed a strange skin condition. He started coughing up blood and experienced welts all over his body. Most disturbing of all, he began having the same nightmare as Kevin Mannis, dream of a terrifying old woman. This was someone he had never met, yet they shared the exact same horrifying vision. Jason Haxton decided to get to the bottom of the mystery. He tracked down the family of the original owner, Havila, and pieced together the box's history. He learned about the seance and how the Dybbuk was trapped inside. He even consulted with rabbis to understand the spiritual significance. They performed rituals to try and contain the entity. Haxton wrote a book about his experiences called the Dybbuk Box, and eventually decided the object was too dangerous to be in private hands. He worked with paranormal investigator Zach Bagans, the host of the popular show Ghost Adventures. Zach was fascinated by the box's dark history and its powerful reputation. He saw it as the ultimate paranormal artifact. In 2017, Zach Bagans became the current owner of the Dybbuk Box. He decided to house it in his haunted museum in Las Vegas, where it remains to this day. But he didn't just put it on a shelf. Understanding its potential danger, he enclosed it in a protective glass case. Visitors to the museum must be over 18 and are required to sign a waiver before viewing it. Why? Because the strange occurrences haven't stopped. Museum staff and visitors have reported feeling a sudden wave of sadness or anger near the exhibit. Some have fainted, while others have claimed to see a dark shadow figure lurking near the box. Even Zach Bagans himself has reported intense personal experiences connected to the object since acquiring it. He has described it as the most terrifying artifact in his entire collection. One of the most chilling aspects of the Dybbuk Box is the contents found inside. It's not what you'd expect. Over the years, different owners have cautiously inspected it. Inside, they found two 1920s pennies, a lock of blonde hair tied with a cord, a lock of black hair, a small statue engraved with the Hebrew word shalom, a dried rosebud, a golden wine goblet, and a single candle holder with 4 octopus-like legs. The purpose of these items remains a mystery, but many believe they are part of the ritual used to bind the Dybbuk to the box. Each item could hold a symbolic meaning, a key to the spirit's confinement. The story of the Dybbuk Box even made it to Hollywood. In 2012, a horror film called The Possession was released, loosely based on the events described by the box's owners. The film brought the legend to a massive new audience, cementing the Dybbuk Box's place in modern paranormal lore. But is it all real? Skeptics argue that the story is a brilliant piece of internet folklore, a modern ghost story amplified by the power of online platforms like eBay and forums. They suggest that the power of suggestion is at play, that people who believe the box is cursed are more likely to interpret everyday bad luck or strange coincidences as paranormal activity. Kevin Manis himself, in 2021, admitted that he fabricated parts of the story to make it more compelling, though he maintains that some strange things did happen. However, he claims he created the story to go along with this unique wine box he built. But what about the other owners, like Jason Haxton, who experienced and documented so much? What about the shared nightmares of the old hag? Can that all be explained away? Whether you believe it's a genuinely haunted artifact, an elaborate hoax, or a psychological phenomenon, the story of the Dybbuk Box is undeniably fascinating. It taps into our deepest fears of the unknown and the idea that some objects can carry an energy, a history, a presence that transcends time. It serves as a modern cautionary tale. Some doors are best left unopened, and some boxes are best left untouched. The Dybbuk Box sits today in Las Vegas, a silent testament to a story that has terrified thousands. Would you be brave enough to see it in person? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into the world's greatest mysteries. Grandma's house always had this smell, a mix of old wood, mothballs, and something sweet, like potpourri left out for too long. I spent summers there as a kid, exploring every dusty corner. But there was one room I was never allowed to enter, the study. The door was always locked, and Grandma would get this tight, strained look on her face if I even asked about it. "Some things are best left alone," she'd say, her voice barely a whisper. The keyhole seemed to breathe, a faint, unnatural light pulsing from within. After she passed away, my parents and I had the grim task of clearing out her home. When we finally opened the study door, the air that hit us was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of decay that had nothing to do with old age. The room was surprisingly sparse. Just a desk, a chair, and against the far wall, a towering, ornate wooden cabinet. We found an old family photograph, but the faces were violently scratched out, as if to erase them from history. It was a beautiful piece, carved from a dark, almost black wood, with intricate patterns of vines and strange, unsettling faces twisted into the grain. It dominated the room, its presence almost suffocating. My dad whistled. "This must be worth a fortune," he said, running his hand over the polished surface. A single, dead moth on the windowsill, a tiny, silent omen. As he touched it, a faint, almost inaudible sound seemed to sigh out from within. We all froze. "Just the old house settling," my mom said, a little too quickly. We decided to move the cabinet back to our place. The lights in the hallway would flicker and die, plunging us into darkness at the worst possible moments. It was too unique to sell. The movers complained about its weight, how it seemed to fight them as they loaded it onto the truck. We placed it in the corner of our living room, where it seemed to watch us, its carved faces a gallery of silent observers. The first week was normal. Then, the whispers started. It was late one night. I was on the couch reading. In the corner of the nursery, the old rocking horse moved on its own, a slow, deliberate rhythm in the dead of night. A faint sound, like wind through leaves, caught my ear. I paused, listening. There it was again, a soft, sibilant hiss, and then, a name. Sarah. It was so quiet, I thought I'd imagined it. Sarah was my mom's name. I peeked into the kitchen. A leather-bound book, filled with symbols I'd never seen, was always left slightly ajar, as if waiting for the next reader. She was washing dishes, headphones on, oblivious. I shook my head, blaming it on a long day. A few nights later, my dad was watching TV when he suddenly muted it. Floorboards creaked in empty rooms, the sound of footsteps with no one there. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I strained my ears. This time, the whisper was clearer, coming directly from the corner where the cabinet stood. "David," my dad's name. He walked over to the cabinet, a puzzled look on his face. Sometimes, in the reflection of the cabinet's polished wood, I'd see a face that wasn't mine, twisted in a silent scream. He ran his hands over the doors, checking the hinges, tapping the wood. "Weird acoustics in this corner," he mumbled, but he looked uneasy. The whispers became a nightly occurrence. Always a name, always someone in the house. It was like the cabinet was learning us, cataloging us. A child's handprint in the dust on the cabinet's surface, though no child had lived in that house for years. My mom tried to dismiss it as drafts or the house's old plumbing, but her eyes darted to the cabinet whenever she thought no one was looking. Sleep became a luxury. I'd lie awake, listening for that soft, insidious sound, my heart pounding in my chest. One night, the whisper was for me. "Alex." It wasn't a hiss this time. From the street, our house was a dark silhouette, except for one window that always seemed to be lit. Watching, it was clearer, like someone was standing right beside my bed, their lips close to my ear. I shut up, my body drenched in cold sweat. The living room was dark, but I could feel the cabinet's presence, a cold spot in the house. I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that the voice had come from inside it. The next day, my dad decided he'd had enough. "There's got to be a rational explanation," he declared, marching towards the cabinet with a crowbar. "Maybe a hidden compartment, some old clockwork thing." My mom and I begged him to leave it alone, a primal fear gripping us, but he was determined. He wedged the crowbar into the seam of the main doors. The wood groaned in protest. As the doors creaked open, a wave of cold, foul-smelling air washed over us, like opening a tomb. It smelled of damp earth and something metallic. Inside, the cabinet was empty, just shelves, coated in a thick layer of dust. My dad let out a frustrated sigh. "See? Nothing." But as he said it, his eyes fell upon the back panel of the cabinet. It wasn't solid wood. It was lined with dozens, maybe hundreds, of small, tarnished brass plaques. Each one had a name meticulously engraved on it. My dad reached in, his fingers brushing against one of the plaques. "Henry," he read aloud. Then another, "Eleanor," and another, "James." They were old names, from generations past. As he moved his hand deeper, he found more recent names, familiar names. Neighbors who had moved away suddenly, a distant cousin we'd lost touch with. A chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature snaked up my spine. Then, my dad stopped. His hand froze. He went pale. He slowly pulled his hand back, staring at a small, newer-looking plaque near the front. On it, gleaming under the dim light, was a single, engraved name, Sarah. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Before we could process it, the whispering started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't one voice. It was a chorus, a cacophony of overlapping whispers, all coming from the dark depths of the cabinet, swirling around us. And they were all chanting the same name. David, David, David. My dad stumbled back, his face a mask of pure terror. He clutched his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It's cold," he stammered, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed to the floor. We called for an ambulance, but it was too late. The paramedics said it was a massive sudden heart attack. But I knew, we all knew, the cabinet had taken him. It had called his name, and when he answered by opening its doors, it had claimed him. My mom and I moved out the next day. We left everything behind, including the cabinet. We couldn't bear to look at it, let alone touch it. We just locked the front door and walked away. We sold the house for a pittance to a company that buys properties as is, no questions asked. We never told them about the cabinet. Sometimes, I feel a pang of guilt about that. I still have nightmares. I see those carved faces, their wooden eyes following me. I hear the whispers, calling names in the dark. A few months ago, out of some morbid curiosity I can't explain, I looked up the new owners of our old house. It was a young family, a couple with a little girl. Their names were Mark, Jessica, and Lily. Just last night, I woke up in a cold sweat, in the dead silence of my new apartment, miles away from that cursed house. I could have sworn I heard a whisper, faint and far away, carried on the wind. It was a soft, sibilant sound, and it was shaping a new name. Mark. They found it. Or maybe, it found them, and now, it's starting all over again. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Stay safe out there. Warning: if you ever hear something call your name from inside a sealed object, do not answer it. Welcome back to Tales of the Dark. Our investigation into the object known as the box that whispers names continues. And this is the moment the story stops being an eerie rumor and becomes something far more disturbing. For weeks, investigators had been documenting the whispers coming from inside the small antique cabinet recovered from the estate sale, carefully recording every sound, every temperature change, every unexplained pattern surrounding the object. But until this point, no one had actually opened it. Several witnesses had strongly advised against doing so. The granddaughter of the cabinet's original owner had warned that her grandmother believed something had been sealed inside it decades earlier by a rabbi, attempting to imprison a malicious spirit. At the time, investigators had treated this story as folklore, an interesting cultural explanation for a strange object, but nothing more. That changed the night one of the researchers decided the only way to determine the truth was to open the cabinet under controlled conditions. The decision was not made lightly. By that time, the cabinet had already been connected to multiple unsettling incidents. Unexplained whispers captured on audio recordings. Sudden illnesses reported by people who spent extended time near the box. And the disturbing pattern in which certain names whispered during the night later corresponded to individuals who died days afterward. But curiosity eventually overcame caution. The research team moved the cabinet into a larger investigation room, where cameras covered every angle. Infrared recorders monitored temperature fluctuations. Sensitive microphones were positioned inches from the wooden doors of the cabinet. The team also brought in a language specialist familiar with Hebrew inscriptions, hoping to understand the symbols engraved on the small stone discovered inside earlier photographs of the cabinet's contents. At 1:47 a.m., the room was sealed and the investigation began. The cabinet sat on a wooden table in the center of the room. The lights were dimmed but not completely turned off, allowing cameras to record clearly while still preserving the atmosphere investigators believed might trigger the whispering phenomenon. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The cabinet remained still. No sounds emerged from inside. Some members of the team began quietly suggesting the earlier recordings might have been environmental noise misinterpreted as voices. But at exactly 2:59 a.m., the temperature sensors began registering sudden changes. The room dropped nearly 6 degrees in less than 30 seconds. One of the researchers commented that the air felt heavy, as if pressure had built up inside the room. Then the tapping began. The microphones captured the same pattern heard during previous nights. Faint rhythmic tapping from inside the cabinet, like fingernails gently striking wood from the other side. The team remained silent as the sounds grew louder. Then the whispering started. The audio monitors picked it up first. A thin, breath-like voice repeating the same word again and again. A name. The language specialist, listening through headphones, slowly raised his head. He recognized the word immediately. It was not just a random name. It was Hebrew. The voice was whispering the word David. Investigators later confirmed that one of the researchers present in the room that night was named David. When the whisper repeated the name again, the man visibly stepped back from the table. The rest of the team began urging the lead investigator to proceed quickly with the planned opening before the phenomenon escalated further. At 3:04 a.m., the cabinet doors were unlocked. The lead investigator hesitated for several seconds before slowly pulling them open. The cameras recorded everything that followed. Inside the cabinet were the same items previously described by witnesses. 2 old coins, a dried rosebud, a lock of hair tied with black thread, and a small stone engraved with Hebrew lettering. But something had changed. The lock of hair was no longer tied the way it appeared in earlier photographs. The thread had loosened slightly, as if something had disturbed it from within. As the investigator reached inside to examine the objects more closely, the room microphones captured a sound no one expected. A whisper louder than any previous recording. It did not come from the cabinet. It came from directly behind the investigator. Every person in the room turned at the same moment, but no one was standing there. The whisper repeated again, this time clearly audible to everyone present. The name David. The researcher with that name later admitted that, when he heard it spoken so clearly behind him, he felt an overwhelming sensation that someone was standing inches away from his shoulder, breathing slowly beside his ear. Several investigators reported feeling sudden dizziness. One camera briefly malfunctioned, producing several seconds of static before returning to normal. During that moment, the language specialist examining the stone inside the cabinet made an unsettling discovery. The Hebrew inscription carved into the granite fragment appeared to form part of a phrase used in certain ancient Jewish protective rituals. Roughly translated, the text suggested something had been sealed away or bound, not destroyed, not removed, bound. This realization changed the interpretation of the cabinet entirely. If the folklore surrounding Dybbuks was even partially accurate, the cabinet might not simply be haunted by a spirit. It might have been deliberately constructed to contain one, and by opening it, the researchers may have weakened the very barrier meant to keep it trapped. What happened next convinced several members of the team that the whispering entity had been waiting for that moment. As the cabinet remained open on the table, the microphones captured something new, multiple voices whispering simultaneously, not repeating the same name anymore, whispering dozens of different names overlapping one another in chaotic fragments of sound. Some investigators recognized their own names among the whispers. Others heard names they did not recognize at all. One of the cameras recorded the cabinet door slowly swinging wider, even though no one touched it. The room temperature dropped another 5 degrees. Then the whispering stopped, completely. The silence that followed was far more disturbing than the noise that came before, because in that moment, the investigators realized something chilling before opening the cabinet. The whispers had only occurred occasionally, but now the phenomenon had changed. Now, the voices seemed aware that someone had listened, and something inside the box had finally been given a chance to speak louder. In the weeks that followed, several members of the research team reported experiencing strange events in their own homes, hearing faint whispering sounds at night, seeing shadows move in reflections, or waking suddenly at exactly 3 a.m. with the unmistakable feeling that someone nearby had just spoken their name. Whether these events were psychological stress or something far darker was impossible to determine. But the investigation had crossed a dangerous threshold, because the next phase would reveal a pattern connecting the whispers. 2 deaths occurring far beyond the room where the cabinet sat. And if that pattern proved real, the box was not simply predicting names, it was choosing them. Subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare. Warning: if an object ever whispers your name, leave the room immediately, because by the time you hear it, it may already be too late. Welcome back to Tales of the Dark. By the time investigators reached the 4th stage of their research into the object now known as the box that whispers names, something had already changed. Before the cabinet was opened, the whispers had been rare, unpredictable, almost hesitant. But after the night the investigators broke the seal and exposed the contents, the phenomenon began accelerating. The voices were no longer faint echoes heard only once or twice a week. Now they were appearing almost every night, sometimes multiple times within the same hour. And the most disturbing part was the pattern slowly forming around the names being whispered. At first, the research team believed the whispers might simply be mimicking names it had already heard spoken inside the room. But the audio logs quickly disproved that theory. Several names recorded during the overnight sessions belonged to individuals who had never visited the building, never spoken with the investigators, and in some cases lived in entirely different cities. The only connection between those names was what happened days later. Many of them died. The research team began documenting each whisper carefully. Whenever the cabinet produced a name, they wrote it down, timestamped the recording, and attempted to locate anyone in the surrounding area who matched the name. At first the results were inconclusive. Names like Michael, Sarah, Daniel, and Maria were too common to link to a specific person. But occasionally a whisper would produce something far less ordinary. A full name spoken slowly and clearly, as if the voice wanted to make sure someone heard it correctly. One of the first confirmed matches occurred when the cabinet whispered the name Eleanor Briggs at 3:12 a.m. during an overnight recording session. None of the investigators recognized the name, but 3 days later, a local newspaper reported that an elderly woman named Eleanor Briggs had been found dead in her home less than 2 miles from the research facility. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. At that point, the investigators still considered the connection a coincidence, until the pattern repeated again. 2 weeks later, the cabinet whispered another name, Anthony Keller. This time, the researchers immediately began searching public records to determine whether anyone with that name lived nearby. They located 3 individuals within the city, but before they could contact any of them, one of those men died suddenly during a construction accident at a downtown building site. What disturbed the investigators most was the timing. The whisper had occurred exactly 48 hours before the accident. As these incidents accumulated, the research team began to realize the cabinet was not whispering names randomly. It seemed to follow a chilling sequence. First came the whisper. Then the person whose name had been spoken would begin experiencing strange disturbances, unexplained fatigue, recurring nightmares, sudden headaches, and in some cases reports of hearing their own name whispered when no one was nearby. Within days, something fatal would happen. The deaths were rarely violent or dramatic. Most appeared ordinary on the surface: heart attacks, accidents, sudden illnesses. But the timing was too consistent to ignore. The box was not predicting death in a mystical sense. It seemed to be selecting someone, and then waiting. By this stage of the investigation, several members of the team began researching the ancient folklore surrounding spirit possession more seriously. Their search repeatedly returned to the disturbing legends connected to the Dybbuk Box, a ritual container believed to imprison wandering souls known in Jewish mysticism as Dybbuks. According to traditional belief, a Dybbuk is not merely a ghost. It is a restless spirit that seeks to attach itself to a living host, often entering through moments of emotional weakness or spiritual vulnerability. Some texts describe Dybbuks as whispering into the ears of potential hosts, slowly weakening their will until the spirit is able to cross into the body. But one rare account described something even more disturbing, a Dybbuk that called out names before choosing its next victim. When investigators compared this folklore to the cabinet's behavior, the similarities were impossible to ignore. If the spirit inside the box was truly a Dybbuk, or something similar, the whispering names might not be predictions at all. They might be invitations, or worse, a method of selecting the next person it intended to reach. The implications of that possibility terrified the research team, because once the box whispered a name, there was no known method of stopping what came next. As the pattern continued, investigators noticed another strange detail. The whispers were becoming more aggressive. Instead of quietly repeating a name once or twice, the voices sometimes screamed the word dozens of times within seconds. During one recording session, the cabinet repeated the same name 43 times in less than 2 minutes. The audio captured something even more disturbing near the end of that recording, a second voice speaking beneath the first. One, slower, deeper, almost like someone answering the whisper. At that moment, the researchers realized the cabinet might not contain only one presence, and if more than one entity had been trapped inside the box, opening it may have done more than simply release a whisper. It may have woken something that had been waiting in silence for decades. The investigation was becoming increasingly dangerous, not only because of the deaths connected to the whispers, but because several members of the research team began reporting the same terrifying experience, hearing their own names spoken when they were nowhere near the cabinet. Some heard it while walking alone at night. Others heard it while falling asleep. Always the same voice. Always the same quiet breath, calling them closer. By the time the fourth phase of the investigation ended, one question remained unanswered. If the whispers were truly selecting victims, what would happen if someone finally answered when their name was called? The final stage of the investigation would attempt to answer that question, and the result would force the research team to make a decision they had avoided from the very beginning. The cabinet would have to be sealed again, because whatever lived inside it was no longer content to whisper. It was starting to listen. Subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare. Warning: if you ever hear something whisper your name from the dark, do not answer, because once you respond, it may already know where you are. Welcome back to Tales of the Dark. By the final stage of the investigation into the object now known as the box that whispers names, the research team had already documented months of disturbing evidence. Dozens of recorded whispers, names spoken in empty rooms, people dying days after those names were heard, cameras malfunctioning, temperatures dropping, and the growing suspicion that the cabinet was not simply haunted, but possibly functioning as a prison for something ancient and restless. But there was still one question no one had been able to answer. What would happen if someone responded when the box called their name? Most investigators refused to test this theory. The risks were impossible to predict, but one member of the research team eventually decided that understanding the phenomenon required confronting it directly. The man later stated that he had grown tired of treating the cabinet like an untouchable relic. If something inside the box truly existed, then hiding from it would never reveal the truth. On the night of the final experiment, the cabinet was placed once again on the investigation table inside the sealed research room. Cameras were positioned around the walls. Microphones surrounded the box. The lights were dimmed as they had been during previous sessions. Only one investigator remained inside the room. Everyone else observed from a monitoring station behind reinforced glass. The man sat alone across from the cabinet as the clock slowly approached. 3 a.m. At first the room was completely silent. The cabinet remained closed. No tapping sounds, no whispers. The investigator later admitted that part of him began to believe the phenomenon might have ended entirely. Perhaps whatever presence had once been trapped inside the box had already escaped after the cabinet was opened weeks earlier. But at exactly 2:59 a.m., the temperature sensors recorded the same sudden drop that had occurred during earlier investigations. The air in the room cooled rapidly. The microphones detected the familiar scratching sound from inside the cabinet, faint movements like something shifting in the darkness. Then the whispering began. At first it was quiet, almost too quiet for the human ear to detect. But the microphones amplified the sound clearly through the monitoring station speakers. A single word repeated again and again. The investigator's name. The man remained still as the whisper continued. According to the video recording, he appeared calm at first, but as the voice repeated his name for nearly 30 seconds without pause, his breathing began to change. The whisper grew louder, not screaming, not aggressive, just persistent, as if patiently waiting for him to respond. Then the investigator finally spoke. The words he said were simple. Yes. For several seconds, nothing happened. The whisper stopped immediately the moment he answered. The room fell completely silent. Even the temperature sensors stabilized. Observers in the monitoring station began exchanging uncertain looks. Had the response broken the pattern? Had the phenomenon simply ended? Then the cabinet moved. The cameras recorded it clearly. The small wooden box shifted slightly across the table, its brass hinges creaking softly, even though no one touched it. The doors slowly opened by themselves. Inside, the objects resting in the cabinet began trembling as if vibrating from a deep, unseen force. The microphones captured something new emerging from the darkness inside the box. Not a whisper this time. Breathing, slow, deep. The investigator sitting at the table suddenly leaned forward, as if listening closely. Observers later said his expression changed in a way they had never seen before. His eyes widened slightly, his posture stiffened, and then he spoke again. But this time the words did not seem directed at the investigators watching through the glass. It sounded as if he was answering someone standing directly in front of him. The problem was, no one else was in the room. The audio recording captured only fragments of what he said next. Phrases like "I understand" and "I hear you," followed by long moments of silence where he appeared to be listening to something the microphones could barely detect. Then the investigator slowly turned his head toward the monitoring station window and whispered something that made every person watching the cameras step back in shock. He said a name, not his own, not anyone inside the building. A name that none of the researchers recognized. Within hours, the investigator was hospitalized after collapsing during the experiment. Doctors later reported severe neurological symptoms they could not explain, extreme migraines, memory gaps, and an inability to recall what he had heard while sitting across from the cabinet. When asked why he spoke that unfamiliar name before collapsing, he insisted he had no memory of saying it at all. But 3 days later, local authorities reported that a man with that exact name had died suddenly in another part of the city. By the time investigators confirmed the connection, the research team realized something terrifying. The cabinet had not stopped whispering names. It had simply found a new way to speak them. After that night, the cabinet was sealed again and placed into controlled storage, where no one was allowed to approach it alone. But the horror did not end there. One of the researchers who had been in the monitoring room, a woman named Dr. Eris Thorne, began to notice strange occurrences in her own apartment days later. It started with the faint sound of scratching from inside her walls, just like the sound from the cabinet. Then objects in her periphery would move when she wasn't looking. A book falling from a shelf, a door creaking open. She tried to dismiss it as stress, a byproduct of the terrifying experiment. But one night, as she lay in bed, a whisper echoed in the silence of her room. It was her name, spoken in that same, patient, persistent tone. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was no longer confined to the box. It had followed her home. The entity hadn't just found a new speaker, it had found new listeners, and it was calling out to them, one by one. But even now, some investigators claim the microphones occasionally capture faint whispering sounds coming from inside the box during the early morning hours. Names, always different, always quiet, waiting. Because the most disturbing theory to emerge from the investigation is this: the entity inside the cabinet may not need to escape the box completely. It may only need someone to answer when it calls. And if you ever hear your name whispered in a room where no one else is standing, remember this warning: do not respond, because the moment you answer, something might finally know you are listening. Subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare.